This was a scheduled conversation with Professor Darkon to discuss his book, Gambling on Development: Why Some Countries Win and Others Lose. It was hosted by Ideas Untrapped, the podcast, and Roving Nights Bookstore. I hope you enjoy it.
Yes, because that would be much more interesting.
Much more scary.
So, I think the obvious place I would start this off is where you started, which is sort of the survey of all the other ideas around development that have been written in the past, the why nation fails in this world, the end of poverty, and so did you have, what was the aha moment for you in picking up on this idea and just running with it?
So, one of the things when you work as an academic in development, everybody, we teach things, we try to, as lecturers, as academics, pick very specifically, say, oh, this is what's important. I thought at some point I had to teach a development studies course for people who didn't know any economics. And it became somehow to think, like, what is it that are the dominant set of views, which is different from what are the best views, which is also different from what you would teach, oh, that's what I want my students to know. So you actually, and so the starting point for that chapter is actually that I had been spending time teaching to students who didn't know anything about economics, what are these dominant views? And it's actually partly also to go a little bit against a view that maybe you'll recognize, is that students think, first of all, that all economists are quite awful people. That secondly, that they only, the only thing they're interested in is money. And anyone who tries to say that economics matters for development, they must be neoliberals or something. And so you kind of wanted to communicate a little bit, look, there's actually diversity in these views, that these people, even though they're economics and they all agree on a few things, to do this. And so there's something there. When you try to write a book, you want to start somewhere. And the literature review is far more boring than actually trying to actually say, well, I think that's dominant thought. This is dominant thought. This is not the best thought, it's dominant thought. And look, I'm not lying. In the book as well, I didn't make it up that I did give these tutorials to the minister when she came into power, and had no clue about it. And it's quite an interesting thing, because what I don't say in the book is that after I had given these tutorials, the whole department in government wanted to know what I told her. So I ended up giving that same lecture that I gave her on all these core thinkers in development, all the best-selling books. I gave that to the civil servants, and I still can close my eyes and see this packed room where there was not just about 200 chairs where everybody's sitting on. People were literally lying on the floor in front of me, because they all, as good civil servants, what did he tell the minister? What did they say? And I think it's important, and it's important to get a sense of what dominant thought is, and because people act because they're influenced by aspects of that dominant thought, also in politics and civil service. So I felt like that's not a bad place to actually start, because if you don't try to explain ideas, it's not about this is all the literature that's been written before, this is all the people I need to quote, but actually this is a dominant thought. Where do I differ? And I don't know whether I succeeded in it, but I still rather enjoyed writing that chapter, because it's not a bad summary of fundamental thinking in economics. And there's actually a small side to it as well, is that I realized suddenly that actually those Nobel Prizes that were given in economics, from anything to do with growth and development, they probably were the right ones, because virtually each of the subgroups had a Nobel Prize winner at some point to it. So it's kind of an interesting thing there. So anyway, I think people will use it for teaching as well in the future because it's an easy, bluffer's guide to for students to actually say, I can't be bothered reading any of these things. I'll just read the summary.
Very interesting. So if I'm going to summarize your argument in the book, I would say you tackling the same question that some of these earlier books have also tried to do, which is that countries that have managed to grow sustainably in the post-war years, I would say maybe from 1960 to date, that have managed to grow sustainably. And what I mean specifically by that is that have managed to reduce poverty drastically and that have managed to transform their economy from a poor agrarian economy to a somewhat industrial one, have elite bargain that is somewhat biased to development. That's how I would summarize that. But like I mentioned on the podcast, actually, one of the commonest reactions I get when I try to discuss this with people is, who exactly are the elites? Right? Who are the elites? I know some prominent people who would disagree there's anything like elites. You know? That you and I, we are the elites. We have one vote. We can always change things if we all rise up. Have you also had similar experiences, and how exactly would you define elites?
Yes. So the question, so these are two different questions. So, maybe it helps when I explain that I'm in all kind of thinking, whether you do it in science or in social science or in other things, we tend to use models. We tend to use abstractions that are not perfect representations of reality, but actually that are a useful tool, kind of heuristic, to actually think about phenomena. So this is the way I would say when I do it in a bookshop and people that actually read these things rather than just promoting the underlying idea, to actually say, well, this is how you should, this is what I'm actually trying to do, is to actually say, what would be the mental model to think about why change happens? And I say, well, let's actually call it the elite. It's not a unified group. It's not necessarily precisely defined, but I can use a term. It's a bit like mathematical. Let's define there is an elite. And who would be the members of that? Well, I can be pretty sure that top politicians will be members of it. Top military leaders will be a member of it. There will be top civil servants, top things. Now then after a bit, some top intellectuals and so on. Now then we start to argue, how broad is that group, how narrow that group is. So this is why I'm also saying these are people with power, but also people with influence. And then actually say, well, it depends a bit on society. Some societies are pretty closed, where actually no thought actually matters. This is actually a slightly more amorphous society, where there's on bits and pieces that people can actually put pressure on things, but on other things that's beyond question. And so maybe it depends a little bit. But think of it more as a kind of a model of thinking. Why do I define it as the elite and not the people? Why is it not we the people, but more a bit like they the elite, or we the elite maybe? It's because there is a group of people that clearly has, relatively speaking, more power than a lot of other people. And so it becomes this idea, by making it we the people, we actually underestimate that there is a group of people that either through history, to power, to money, to might, to whatever it is, somehow influences more what's going on. So I just want to put that there, because otherwise we get very naive. And the point of it's more, this is a group of people who, and maybe I should have written this better, they have, if they want to stop something, they can do it. In fact, today at the event, your ex-president Obasanjo was actually putting it quite well. They have blocking power. There is a bunch of people that blocking power. Now some have more blocking power than others, but they are that group. And and there's a lot of people who have zero blocking power. And so that's a bit more. That's what is the elite, is somehow make sure you have a sense, a model of thinking is power exists and influential people exist as well, and they are there. Changes a bit, does to move a bit, but and I like. Okay, I come from the UK, and I'd like been working, living there, and sitting in a government department. I can tell you that definitely there are a bunch of people in business in the UK that have proportionally far more power than other people in business. There are definitely people who happen to have an ancestor who may have been carrying the sword of a Norman knight in 1066, so basically someone who came there with William the Conqueror. They probably are still millionaires now because they have inherited land and so on, and they have a bit more influence than a lot of us, and so on. So it's a bit like that. You think about what are they, and that's a bit of the core thing. And the rest of the core idea is there. But the elite, if they don't put themselves behind growth and development, if they don't have this bias and saying, there is something that's actually worth pursuing and actually coordinating implicitly or explicitly some of our actions around. If they don't do it, it won't happen. And that's basically where it sets the bias. So I'm still there with it. But it's still a model. There's no exactness about it. I can't write that set of members in an exact way for any society. But I still know a bunch of people who are not in it and a bunch of people who are in it.
So I think a lot of Nigerians can relate to what you're describing, because I would say from say 2007, if you're running for president, for example, you have to visit Obasanjo, you have to visit Babangida, former military head of state, Abdul Salam, who's also a former military head of state, and a bunch of other powerful business people. And as much as we are always curious, why do you have to go there? Like, do they control who votes? What power exactly do they wield? So my question then would be, how do elites influence what happens in society? What's like the transmission mechanism for their power?
So, and again, in different societies it will be slightly different, but Nigeria in the end, as you say, people have a vote, and there's not usually a gun next to your head when you vote in ball. So
sometimes there is.
Yes, but not usually, but it is not quite there. So in a sense, there is an element in that. So you have to ask yourself, how does that operate? Well, money plays a role. Party financing plays a role. Who needs to be on your ticket and who needs to be, what are the conditions for some of the money transfers that you actually have to have a link. It then links back into business. It links up to kind of particular groups, who you do. So, whether you look in the US, in the UK, or in Nigeria, in an abstract way, these things matter. Money and the link between politics and business will matter. The link with the security system, the military, it probably will matter. I don't know how it will matter exactly here, and I don't know in many countries how exactly, but they will take an interest, and so on. So there are ways that power can operate that actually can influence what is the information that's being provided to individuals, how people, if you vote for X, you implicitly vote for Y and Z as well. It's that kind of links that you actually get there. So there is no, and it's elements of what, in this case, the imperfections of democracy, but it's there. You go to America and we worry about money in politics there. We go to the UK, we worry about money in politics as well. We do it in different ways here, but it shapes that. It's not that everyone who wants to stand for presidential candidate will get the same extent of exposure, the same chances to actually be judged as well. So it works. And, it works in complicated ways, but it is there.
As we were discussing earlier, challenge with writing a book like this, kind of like with the Smoglu and Robinson, where it's all institutions and a lot of others, is then people then shoehorn your ideas into looking for precise answers. So I'm sure you get the question a lot, like what exactly, if you have to write a cliff note, what exactly do I have to do as a country to get from poverty to prosperity? And you made the pain of repeating over and again that there is no precise answer. Every country has to find a way. But what I'm curious about is from some of the case studies in the book and places that you've observed as a researcher, what are the likely ways that the development target emerges? Is it all accident? Is it a case of deliberately fashioning out a development target in some cases? Which are the ones that you really observe?
So I think there's a couple of different ways. Okay, so one of the striking things when you look at countries as diverse of China or Indonesia or Bangladesh or go to Ethiopia, Rwanda, what appears to be behind it is a mixture of crisis or a worry about a turning point. And there's nothing like a crisis that potentially can focus people's minds. Conflict as well. Of course, not every conflict leads to a good outcome. The best predictor for future conflict, is having had past conflict. It's just a statistical fact. But that actually focuses people's minds to do it. Big turning points as well. In Western countries, world wars had a big impact. And then you get crises of legitimacy, often come a bit linked to it. When things are going a bit downhill, there needs to be some kind of, and that becomes self-interest behavior of those in power, to say, wow, we risk here losing power unless we proactively try to start acting. Okay? So let me actually mention this. So I've been spending a bit of time in Mauritius. It's not in the book. It's quite an interesting case here. This is a country that, at the time of independence, was a middle-income country. It was actually richer than Nigeria was, than most African countries. And it came only independent in 1968. But then he went through a pretty troublesome 1970s, as a lot of countries after independence. But actually, by the late 1970s, it had already a deep macroeconomic crisis. And clearly it was not going anywhere. It looked a little bit as if the prediction of James Mead, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, he basically had written in 1962, one country we can be certain about nothing will ever happen with is Mauritius. And he was totally convinced, high population growth, terrible climate conditions and so on. So that was quite an interesting thing. But really interesting as well that they then started planning for structural adjustment as a government. This was quite a left-wing thing. So they actually started structural adjustment in 1979, which is very early. They called in IMF early on. They implemented it in 83, 84. Actually, by 1987, they were growing at 7-8% per year. Now, if you then think what happened there, it's really interesting. It became somehow people in business realizing that their own future wasn't going to go anywhere on the island. The government was actually a leftist government, a Labour government, that was very much had been campaigning for the rights of the workers and so on. They actually, there's not a formal deal, but they actually suddenly started working together. State-business relationships suddenly improved a lot. And so you get an interesting thing because the business wants to grow their economy, and so they started working together very well around things like, I don't know whether this still rings a bell, Lomé, the early agreements of trade with Europe. they were incredibly good at lobbying for sugar, and they had an incredibly good deal. They started working on trade agreements, very actively doing, because they said, we need to transform, we need to start getting export processing zones. They had export processing zones in the 1980s. They started doing smart things. In the end, as you know, then in the 90s and a bit beyond, they went to finance. Incredibly dynamic finance industry. But that was all part of saying, look, we need to keep on progressing, and this was actually state and business working together. So again, the initial conditions were not necessarily better or worse than other countries. But somehow it became, within a crisis, actively thinking, and a bit of an unlikely coalition, a relatively left-wing government, representing all focus on equity, and then another group that wanted growth, and actually finding that balance that works for their societies. And actually people still say that's fundamentally the contract in that country, which is between all the governing parties that change power. They all kind of semi-left-wing or centrist left-wing parties. And they have a functioning democracy, but a clearly good relationship with business, and it's still growing and it's being continued. So how does it come about? In that place they found, somehow within a crisis, a way of acting. So you have that in quite a lot of different countries, is to, a meeting of minds somehow. It's very hard to say what you do. It can't get you the silver bullet, because it is literally moving from an equilibrium that is actually not getting that much growth and low development, to actually somehow a set of behaviors between different parts of the elite here, this was trade unions and government, to actually start working for another equilibrium. So I can't predict that, how that will start happening. But it is about the meetings of minds and beginning to find a way to carve out somehow a consensus around them and actually move it.
Let's talk about Nigeria. I will not exactly say that we are at a crisis point, but a lot of people think we are. Some would even say whether or not the country remains a country.
Whether it is a country.
Whether or not it remains a country.
Whether it is a country.
Depends on the outcome of the elections. But I mean, many times in your career, you've played the role of the outside expert looking in. So when you look at Nigeria, what do you see as along the typology of your book and analysis?
As I think I give a sense in the book as well, and definitely in endless conversations and podcasts, Nigeria is usually used as the other example relative to the countries that managed to get an elite bargain for development, where it goes a little bit between either, and sometimes I'm in two minds, because it thinks it's two things at the same time. It's either an elite bargain that is actually pretty stable because the game in town is very clear, and everybody understands it in politics and in the state. And the game in town is in the end still, there's a guaranteed source of resources, whatever we do, and we know how to deal with that. There's a story of oil, of course, $400 or $500 per year of rents, not all of it for government, but that's basically the kind of revenue. If you divide it, that's per capita, $400 or $500. If you divide it amongst 200 million people, that's nothing. If you divide it amongst 100,000 people, it's $1 million a piece. So it means if we then give some $50,000, that means that for some of them there is 10, 20 million per year available. So that's a pretty good elite bargain. It's pretty stable. Lots of people will be happy with the $50,000-$60,000, and they're part of it, and so on. And that's the stable thing. That's the one thing. That's the stable part of the elite bargain. It's the status quo that actually knows. And I've been working, in fact, even some of you with it. It's basically you sell oil to the rest of the world, and the rest is non-tradables. The rest is all recycling of money, which is non-tradables by its nature. It's moving the money around in the country, and that's what that economy is. It's a lot of very interesting things, and I keep on begging people. When will I know anything is changing in Nigeria? When I can buy something from Nigeria in London, and I will be so delighted because I said the country is doing something else. That's the stable part. And then the other part is what you're alluding to. Is it even a country? Is the fragmented in it? Where, there are moments and many things, not least when it comes to politics, in the elections, that suddenly you are multiple elites that are fragmented. And then basically it's not even, then at that moment it's not a country. So you historically had occasions that it was really totally fragmented. In other places that maybe it was a little bit together. But so you have that balance between, as if there's two equilibrium where you move between, an elite bargain where nothing really good is happening in growth and development, and another elite bargain where potentially it's actually fragmentation and conflict. And people are worried about that second one. So why is that one? That actually the upside is why nobody works towards. And that actually is the kind of elite bargain that I want to see. Is to say, look, you risk keep on drifting into that bad one if you're not careful, because the rents don't really grow. There's the rents in the oil elite bargain is not growing. It's pretty stagnant. If anything, it's going down. Yeah. So you have, and I'm not going to compare you with South Sudan, but I will now for a second. South Sudan is an interesting one because it's another one on natural resources, and there is actually he's already gone to that total turning point, because whenever oil prices are high, the elite bargain suddenly there's peace deal because there's money to go around. Every time the oil price goes down, there's a risk for the fragmentation. I wouldn't be surprised that there's a little bit of a pattern here as well. That during crisis, there's fragmentation, because then somebody said, oh my God, I'd better be in control of all this rent because there's very little now left. Anyway, but you want to start thinking, what is that upside? What is that other one? And that's basically where I talk about. So yeah, I want to believe, and look, I don't want to go the route of James Mead that I mentioned on Mauritius. I don't want to be the one that says nothing will ever happen from Nigeria, because fortunately for all of you, I'll never win the Nobel Prize, because otherwise you may well get up. But there's the curse of the Nobel Prize guy, because we wouldn't know about this quote that he says nothing would come from Mauritius. But there is a kind of, I'm not saying it's maybe with you, Toby, there. It's not as if it's fundamentally worse than it has been before, I think. But we just don't get that upside defined. We don't get that upside acted towards. And that's where the difference will lie, is that, can one get one's act together here? They're actually somehow getting a little bit more coherence and consistency that works towards that other kind of potential equilibrium, which is, some decent growth. This is sufficient. Maybe let me add a point. This is a sufficiently fragmented country that don't dream of Singapore growth. Don't dream of that stuff. East Asian growth is virtually impossible to think of. That's so exceptional. These were exceptional circumstances, exceptional countries. But let's say you should at least have the ambition that you do better than Malawi or something, which at the moment is outperforming you in growth. You should be able, given your location and your resources, compared to a country that has nothing, you should at least be better. So it's about, can you get to the 4-5% growth per year, which is what a natural thing, per capita would mean 3% or so. You want to get to the 2 to 3% consistently, and some years 3-4% per capita growth, given the thing, and that's what you need, and I just don't see it at the moment quite happening.
It's interesting. Let's talk about. I know it's a much maligned theory in economics. The resource cost, the so-called resource cost. And how it ties in with the development value, right? So, you're right. What keeps elites aligned is that resource, that oil. But recently, there's some kind of problem. High oil prices, we are still complaining, because production numbers have actually plummeted. From 2 million barrels a day to 900,000. And now everybody is screaming that there's a crisis. The parliament is screaming, the presidency is screaming, the CEO of the national oil company is rummaging through the forest looking for oil thieves.
Yes.
You know, so from a citizen's perspective, should we pray that this oil keeps stolen? That so that we can at least get the people that matter to start thinking about something else, exports, economic diversification.
So, okay, so first of all, like, does a resource curse exist? You know, it has, or it sets certain incentives in an economy. And the economic incentives are essentially to do with, I don't have to grow the economy because I will still have the resources. Okay, so I'm less worried about what people originally talked about in the resource curse, about macroeconomic management and so on. We've learned, the Dutch disease thing. Over the last 30, 40 years, any reasonable, sensible governor of a central bank, I don't know why I'm posing for a moment, but any reasonable governor of a central bank would actually know more or less what to do. Okay, so you can handle that. You need to, handle that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you can. The macroeconomic costs are there, but it's actually relative to the revenue you get. You should be able to handle it. But it's the incentive part that you allude to, because that means you don't have to bother to grow. You don't have to bother to do the difficult things. Now, the problem with your reasoning, Toby, here is that I am not entirely convinced that it works symmetrically. If I don't have natural resources, then I will have incentives as an elite to try to grow the economy. If I had natural resources, but they're beginning to go down, you may have what I was describing as the South Sudan incentive, that actually say, well, they're going down now, oh my God, we better kick these other guys out so that we can control it. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't work symmetric. That's in the sense that, once you've had it, actually the incentives in the elite, because that's the elite you have. You've grown that, you've set up that elite. It's a very different elite that would have emerged if you started without natural resources. Yeah. It would have been a very different, because it would have been an elite that had to sell some things abroad, because otherwise there wouldn't have been any dollars to send your kids to school in England. So you would have had a very different elite, and it needs a different skill to manage natural resources and distributing it amongst your friends than actually growing up and setting up a textile, a garment factory, and a metals factory. It's a different type of people, as you know. It's like a different set of skills to run a political racket or an oil racket than actually building up a proper business. So that's a bit like, it's a hard one, because do you want to hope and pray that it goes down? Well, I'm not entirely convinced that process of going down will be that peaceful, or that transition will be that smooth. That's all. But if you had a government in power with some foresight, of which we've had some in Asia, Indonesia had oil, very similar amounts initially than what you had, and they had at least the foresight in thinking about, well, we're better put some infrastructure in place and whatever, because sooner or later we won't have this. And now oil is relatively unimportant for the Indonesian economy, relatively speaking. You have the same with other Asian countries. So that's what I kind of mean by it, to say, like, I don't want to wish you that you don't have it, but not least with the dwindling, because the process may be painful. Have I now implicitly said there is a resource curse? I've actually said, well, if you're not careful, there is one. And I'm afraid in this country, they haven't really been careful. You've got yourself in that equilibrium. While other countries with natural resources didn't necessarily get themselves in that same kind of mess. I'm being pessimistic here, isn't it?
No.
There's no agenda.
I'm basically saying it's a blessing, but it could be a curse.
So, earlier today, you sounded like a Nigerian, which comes to something you mentioned earlier. I was reading on the news, a regional government in India saying that, if we are not careful and if we keep going the way we do, we're going to become Nigeria, where nothing seemed to work. So, but the way Nigerians would sort of respond to that after all the abuses, of course, which is why I say it sounded like an Nigerian. No, but we have a lot of potential. Nigeria has this incredible potential. If only we can do this and this and this. So every generation is impatient. So, but curiously, are we simply, because these processes are never smooth, they're always a bit messy, and then some things click into place and they become reinforcing. So, are we simply living through history? Like, I think I asked you this on the podcast as well, that is there a path dependency where every country eventually gets it? The speed may be different.
Well, when you look at history of the last couple of centuries, gradually more and more countries seem to get their act together, and so there's a cause there for optimism, but it won't just happen. and for all these countries, it required actions and behaviors of those who can make a difference, and in some cases may have been a bit more disruptive than in other places. But yeah, so I definitely don't have a view of history that it will all be good in the end. It is, because and that's a little bit of the kind of set of countries in the developmental history, is that there were quite a lot of the countries that, like some of these Asian countries, some of them were actually linking back at some, historical progress they were making, and then actually was kind of maybe interrupted and brought back. So they were really kind of catching up, but they had a kind of a path that had followed. Nigeria, maybe the DRC, it's even worse. You've got path dependence in the other direction, and it goes a little bit further and further down, where you say, look, the longer the mess continues, the harder it will be to get out of that as well. But why did I sound like a Nigerian? Because I can't work on global development issues without being an optimist. This is all we have, because it's a pretty dire place, and it's actually the extent of places, the places that are left behind, you're more and more cross about, because say it shouldn't happen anymore. Once you see a lot of the other places started to move up, I used this morning, I mentioned Bangladesh. It was a dramatically dismal place in the 1970s. It was dramatic and so much suffering and incredibly high suffering, and then they crawl out of it fairly quickly. Then you kind of say, Nigeria, get your act together. But the potential is, you can't doubt it. It is. There has always been a lot of potential, and it is one of these puzzles. Why is it not doing better? It is why is it? It's almost a bit like, why is it as bad as it is? It's almost a bit of a puzzle here that it shouldn't be, because that, like anyone and any outsider visiting this place, you see a lot of dynamism, you see a lot of stuff happening, and then you see a lot of incredible attempts by people with power and influence to squash it all and to make it really hard, and they're still standing and they're still trying. I think it would be unwise to give up. It's also a bit location. I should actually add to that. Here in Lagos, no coastal place in the world should ever be typecast of not having potential. I'll be traveling to Niger. Niger are a bit more worried about. Middle of nowhere, so to speak. The only thing it has is some natural resources, huge pressures on all kinds of other things, poor people living of agriculture with climate change hitting far more than already here, and so on. This is a place where there's plenty of opportunity here.
So, I mean, you've obviously, I'm speaking for the people here. Sorry. You've obviously interacted.
You're a very modest man.
So you've interacted with members of our elite, right? So the people want to know, right? What do they tell you is the problem? Because I think they get it. I mean, when you talk about all these things, and some of them that have read your book, they see the problem, right? So what is the challenge? What is preventing movement? Or should I say, what is the excuse?
So, okay, this is probably maybe three different things. So the first thing is that, I have indeed interacted also with senior policymakers, Buhari's team, the governor at central bank, and so on. And I will actually say that at least when it comes to economic matters, that I will have had sometimes conversations that can only be described as, what would be a good word? Disingenuous. Disingenuous.
Okay.
That they actually are telling you a story, but that there's another story why certain things happen. That story is about the narrative and the ideology of what needs to be done in the economy. It's all about protecting interests. And that you do certain types of policies, but you know very well that you do it for a very different reason. Okay, and let me just call it out, exchange rate policy. It's for very different reasons. There's no economics that would ever tell you that what they're doing is for such a long period of time with multiple exchange rates ever makes sense. It's just, it's a distortion, it's a road to macroeconomic ruin, and you know that. You know that very well, but you don't correct it because there are interests that like it. Okay? I say it another man. But that's a one level, okay? Then there is a second level of, people that you talk to and then they think, you're absolutely right, but it's not my problem. And that's very easily, or sometimes when tomorrow I'll talk to also people from the business community, it is their problem. Because you cannot just say, oh, it's nothing to do with me. But meanwhile, totally responding to all the incentives that our terrible system is set, and not even beginning to think that you bear some responsibility for its continuation. And so the idea of the private sector, I'm just responding to incentives. There's a moment that you say, no, well, look, I should actually use my influence to actually set a different set of incentives. Okay? And so you get behaviors on issues to do with trade, on issues to do with what investments will you do, and so on, that you say, look, I know this is if there was rational economic policy making going on here, this investment would never be profitable, some type of import substitution or whatever, or some type of agricultural investment that you do it. You say, well, you would never do it because in a different exchange rate, this would never be viable. And actually, it would be a totally different thing would be viable. But actually, what you do by investing in it, you make it a little bit longer viable, and you make it persist, and you make some money on the side. So that's what that means, that you're part of it. You are shaping these incentives, that you can use your influence to say, look, yes, I know I can make money from the incentives you set here, but can actually at the same time lobby that they shouldn't be there. And that's the part of the responsibility. It's nothing to do with me. And then the third group is, I think, where there are some, and that's where it is hard, where I don't have a good enough answer for, is those people that actually generally says, look, I would like to be an actor, whether it's politically or economically, that actually sets different incentives, behaves differently. Yeah? But actually, it's really hard for me to do this because the only person that gets hurt is me, because everybody else will make a profit from my behavior. And so take an example is a corruption. Take corruption. Corruption is a collective action problem. It exists because everybody else believes that everybody else acts like this. And it's a very hard one. You know, you say, well, I can't win a government contract unless I do a backhander. Therefore, I pay a backhander. Because if I stop doing this, I will never get a government contract anymore. And you do it because you believe otherwise someone else will do the same and they will get a contract. So breaking that is really hard. And so that's the coordination problem, the collective action problem of change. That's the harder one. That's where probably my book tries to talk about, is saying, can one find processes of consensus making that certain behaviors we won't do anymore? That there's actually a whole group, you know, imagine a whole group of construction firms, really important, the most efficient construction firms, suddenly saying, we won't do this anymore. And then you could only get on second-rate construction firms getting the contracts, but they'll never be efficient. And so on. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard to see that happening, but that actually is what you do. So that third group is the one that you kind of, I feel sympathy for, because it's hard to break through it, because I don't have an easy answer for. But the second group is lazy, and the first group are crooks.
Mm-hmm.
That's powerful right there. When you look at Africa, and I know you're traveling quite a bit in Africa which are the countries that make you optimistic? I know you talked about Ethiopia in the book, even though they've been a bit wobbly lately. You've also mentioned Mauritius right now. Obviously, Nigeria is not. So, but because Africa seems like there's a lot of focus on Africa as the final frontier, because it seems like this place where there is stubbornness in terms of getting growth to really happen. So, which are the countries that make you really optimistic when you look at Africa?
So this is the moment that in 20 years, if I ever anyone ever check me, I will realize, oh my God, he thought that these countries would be successful and this would be famous. So this is where you stick your neck out. But given what I know now and what I see, is that I'm actually, you know, and in some sense I'm already burnt on Ethiopia. I didn't really expect it to go that pear-shaped and so complicated. Yes. You know, that the underlying elite bargain for development would break down so dramatically on the political front. Because, you know, these were people that used to work very closely together, and they had a common idea around the development and growth. Yes, they reached a critical stage, but then it somehow broke down. So Ethiopia is there, and it also is proof that it not necessarily will always be sustained, that it is a gamble that can misfire. I'm optimistic about East Africa, actually. I think they did a couple of things that is actually beginning to pay off, and I think the first one is that, and if I think now, take all four of them, so Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, unfortunately not, but these four, they at least got themselves into some reasonably credible politics for macroeconomic stability. So they actually have very competent, they've had a series of competent central bank governors. You know, there's a certain stability around the economy. And as a result, actually, you know, Tanzania, Kenya, they're actually growing pretty well. So there's a bit of a credibility there. And then so there is a certain credibility around East Africa, the kind of the way the macroeconomies run. And then they've learned somehow to take advantage of opportunities a bit better. So they've been cautious with the natural resources they discovered. They've been actually cautious of bringing them online. They're a bit slower than that's the new generation of natural resource-rich countries actually is being much more sensible. They're taking more time to build it up and thinking about it. So that's a good thing. And then they do the East African community. They actually work quite well together. You know, you may have the comprehensive free trade agreement in Africa, the free trade area. But actually, it's only really credible at the moment in East Africa, where they have it much earlier, they're moving well. You know, that gives a certain sense of maturity around the economy. Tanzania have been growing really well. They came out of COVID. They used, for example, gold very smartly to stabilize the macroeconomy. So they actually sold more gold when the other exports went down to stabilize the economy. That's how you use your natural resources smartly. Kenya similarly. Kenya has come good in some sense. The elections show that again, is that they can get a transition of power against the odd incumbent, so to speak, or the worst the incumbent party loses power. It's been remarkably peaceful. You know, a little bit of wobble, but virtually nothing. So they can get that political stability and so on. So there's many things on these places. You know, I like to also mention Ghana. Ghana got its act together. You know, it's a small place, relatively small relative to Nigeria, but it's not small by African standards, and it's done reasonably well. Since the 1990s, got its political stability. I remain optimistic. You know, there's wobbles there on the macroeconomy in the way they manage it, but you know, one of the things I like about Ghana, they're very smart users of the IMF. You know, and that actually is one of the thing to do is that, you know, rather than making a big deal of, oh, we can't call in the IMF because they are the enemy, they're whatever, the ideological thing. You know, you use the IMF as politicians is when you can't sell your reforms to your people anymore yourself. And so when your central bank is not enough independent and too much politically controlled, then you need the IMF to essentially be your independent central bank. And it's actually what Ghana has done. And actually that's happening in countries that are quite clever about how to do this. You know?
That's interesting because I was talking to actor Mahmoud, and he actually said the same thing about Bangladesh, that when they are trying to push through a very difficult reform that is tough to sell, they simply call the IMF and use that as a cover. So which then brings me to the role of multilateral institutions and all this. A lot of people, you still get this tired analysis in Nigeria where they blame everything on the structural adjustment program in the 80s. And now that we are rapidly approaching a debt crisis, we are thinking it's only a matter of time before the IMF comes in. I think that would be a good thing. A lot of people think it's a bad thing. So, on the question of multilateral institutions, their role, especially in the development bargain, what critical role do you think play? Can they play the credible bad guys the way the IMF seems to be doing? I remember last year when I had an interview with the IMF mission director in Nigeria. She more or less privately told me that they don't care whether the people blame them or not. They are well insulated from the direct effects of that criticism. But some people would look at that as being unaccountable and somewhat dangerous in a country. What's your view?
So I think in countries where there is a development market, or basically fundamentally they want growth and development and all that. So if you think there's like two types of the multilateral, there's the IMF, which is a bit like for the macro stability. Basically, it's the kind of short-term macro stabilizing kind of force. And then this organization like the World Bank or African Development Bank, they give the longer-term loans. Okay. So the latter, once you have somehow a government that's really committed to development, I think the latter are totally unproblematic. You know, basically, you know, in principle, we have these institutions to support development, and if a country wants development, it makes a lot of sense to use them. And I think a country that is unsensible uses them sensibly. They don't let the World Bank tell them too much what to do because, fortunately, broadly enough, they want development. The IMF is interesting because I was alluding to with Ghana, and it's clearly interesting that Dr. Mohammed was actually saying this for Bangladesh, and I know he talked about it in Bangladesh as well. The same was in Indonesia and so on, in these countries where, you know, you do have a political system that is somehow, you know, whether it's democratic or whether it's pushed from the streets, whatever it is, you know, politically adjusting your economy, you know, limiting your fiscal deficit when it got out of hand, or dealing with a crisis when your balance of payments is in trouble or your exchange rates is in trouble, it's difficult because there are people losing, there's people as losers, you know. Now, if you can do it internally, you know, that's of course that's arguably is the best. You know, that's, your sovereignty is not affected and nobody tells you what to do. But sometimes you just can't do it politically. You know, and in the end, when we even go back to the 1980s, you know, countries were in deep trouble. And you know, there is a logic. You know, it's like my view on economics is largely stopping countries doing stupid things. There's an economic rationality of having, you need some macroeconomic stability. You can't get it. You know, can't get inflation totally out of hand and so on. You could argue about the nuance and whatever. So the IMF is really useful in a country like that, where you're doing development bargains, somehow it misfires. You bring them in and you blame them, you're the bad guys, you blame them for everything and you use them. So I don't mind that people still talk badly about the IMF at times for the 1980s and so on. As long as they're willing to accept that adjustment was required, that the economy was in trouble and needed to adjust. Mm-hmm. And the countries who played it well, they played it essentially by, you know, bringing it in as the independent central bank when your own central bank can't do the adjustment. They can't do the monitoring, they can't restrict the fiscal expenditure, they can't do it. So basically, they do that. The problem arises probably on the other side. Where do I put the multilaterals when it comes in a country where there's no development market? Like here. Actually, it's a bit more problematic for me because World Bank and other lending, you know, government doesn't really want development. I'm not saying necessarily here, but let's say broadly speaking, it's not really a growth-oriented government. You know, World Bank wants growth and development. You know, we can't start behaving and we give it finance while meanwhile, you know, you give it to essentially in a country where the objective function is something totally different. It's not going to be a good use of money. You're going to behave as if it's given for the good thing, and you invent conditions and whatever. It never works. Conditions don't work, so it's no point. So that I'm worrying about the role that World Bank and African Development Bank can play. You know, you want to be much more careful because, you know, you give these resources and then they don't use them well, and then you lock in the elite even longer. The IMF is actually a bit tricky because there's damn smart countries, and this time I'm not going to name them. It's not Nigeria, but I'm not going to name them. But there are countries that actually, where the elite and those in power play it really carefully. Because actually, funnily enough, elites like macro stability as well. So they're quite happy to get the IMF involved without doing anything of the structural change that's required. The IMF is actually sometimes a little bit too easy to provide the resources for the stability because they do the basic macro things. They cut a bit of education, social sectors, and everything is fine. They do the fiscal thing. But not at all with a vision of we want to get ready for growth. But actually becomes a bit of an excuse, or you give us a bit of a lifeline and now we can do the same game. Actually, let me name one place, Pakistan. It's doing its 23rd IMF program since independence, of which 22 have failed. I was actually saying this on something. So no, there's one that was successful out of the 22. Okay, fine, I rest my case. You know, and it's basically these programs never come to an end because they briefly give a lifeline to a government that's trying to gamble to stay in power, and then somehow the whole process, because the elite is totally fragmented, or then they get kicked out, and then the new government comes into power and blames everything on the IMF, and then makes rubbish as well. So they never structurally try to set the economy up for growth. And so that's the problem with the IMF as well. It's almost too happy to go and help at times, and even in a place where they don't really want to.
I was just going to get into that. Like, how do you keep yourself from getting conned, right, as a multilateral, especially with also the geopolitics that's involved? There was this whole controversy on Twitter around the time of the death of the Queen, which was about the UK's tacit support for the federal government in the Civil War. like how do you keep yourself from being conned into backing a government that is not really serious, that are just Oxford, no offense, Oxford educated guys in suits
I'm not part of the
who are in government, who know all the right words, they have all the fancy PowerPoint presentations, but the moment there's some stability, they go back to their politics.
Yeah, you don't learn good PowerPoints in Oxford. That's when you do 6 months of McKinsey stuff. But your point is serious and important, and it's actually the point here is really so part of the multilateral system, the way it's set up, and I do find it problematic, is actually to allow getting a quota. And yes, there's all kinds of conditions, but I don't think they work that well. And so there is that kind of sense there that the system is settled. The IMF is a little bit more tricky, I think, because its mandate, its historical mandate, is this kind of sense of, if a country gets out of hand, if it then gets even more out of hand, it will even be more costly. It could be contagion to the neighboring countries and so on. So that's a slightly different one. So I can see that an IMF is actually almost, it's maybe, at times quote unquote consciously will get caught. Because there's enough reasons, if you do not want think of what happened in Greece, for example, in Europe. You don't want it totally default because the contagion would be really bad, in fact, even on the global economy. So you kind of say, or in the Asian crisis, somewhere more serious than others and so on. So yeah, so you get it. But the geopolitics is probably the more spicy topic in it. And I think that's a really tricky thing these days for the multilaterals. And the last time geopolitics played a role was the 1970s and 80s, especially the 1980s. And of course, structural adjustment looked as it looked, partly because of the Cold War. So it looked much more than we probably now would do it, on the basis of our best knowledge, much more like an ideological view of how things should be done. Okay, now it was a lot to do with geopolitics, proving in the end much of the capital from the World Bank and from the IMF in the end is provided by Western countries. And as a result, they have a bit more voice in the board. So as a result, that when they're playing geopolitics with it as well, in a subtle way, why structural adjustment looked as it did, even though it probably was necessary, it didn't have to be in detail as it looked to help. So we have the risk that this will come back. That's the illusion I want to make, is that actually you kind of worry about that you don't want to go back to the 1980s because the way we were dealing with these crises was more painful than probably it should have done. In fact, no Western country would ever have done it in their own country than in the way it seems to have happened in some countries. I'm not particularly saying Nigeria more or less, but and I do think that IMF and World Bank actually have learned in the last 20 years, whenever they had to adjust economies, they did. It's actually much more, willingness to have space for the own ideas of the country. Homegrown adjustments were much more common. So I worry a bit where we're going now. That for geopolitics, this will become harder again. So that we'll get a kind of slightly more ideological process and so on. And multilaterals, it's problematic. Yeah, because they want to behave. It's purely technical competence. But in a lot of geopolitics, who controls the board? You worry about it. And I'm seriously worried about it. That we'll get into cases where things will be done in ways that we wouldn't have done 10 years ago. Okay, because of geopolitics and language around it and so on. Let me give one example. There is a debt crisis, and the debt looks very different these days because there's some China debt. Some people would say it's all intentionally a debt trap policy of China. And in this whole semi-Cold War kind of atmosphere, there's no Western country will move on anything unless China moves as well. Why would China move? Well, probably for the relations with the country, but they will not want to do it because Western countries want it to do it. You see, and that's where Cold War and geopolitics is going to be pretty bad for quite a few countries in the next couple of years. So we'll hopefully not, but there's a risk.
Finally, before I turn this over to the audience, speaking of China, I am worried a bit about China's influence on the development narrative in Africa. The Justin Lin anecdote in the book was quite instructive for me, and also quite in consonance with my personal experience of city person, where it always has to be distinct. And I mean, you just talked about the former chief of staff of the president told you, she said that, I mean, if you don't give us this loan, we'll go to the Chinese. They'll give us one. And then they finance a lot of these chronistic projects, railroads to nowhere. So how do you, what are your thoughts on China's influence on development? The part that really worries me is by simply saying that the only way to get development done is for the states to play this outsized role. I'm not opposed to the states being involved. The state has to be involved, right? That is where the legitimacy comes from. Because in a lot of African countries, Nigeria inclusive, are a state culture that is rather predatory. And I'm nervous about simply handing power to such states. What do you think?
No, look. There's lots of that I agree with what you just said. Is that this whole idea the state must be the fundamental driver of anything to do with growth and development is well, it's first of all empirically totally unproven, but also as an ideology, and in the book as well, I'm really scared about doing development or economic policy from an ideological point of view, because every country needs to be pragmatic if what's possible within its own context. And the state as it has been built up historically in most African countries is quite clientelist in the sense that it's not meritocratic. It's basically built up giving jobs because you have power and influence, and you need to reward those who sustain the power and influence. And I understand that. That's part of the elite bargains that exist, whether they're a bit developmental or not. And once we have that, you'll get a huge amount of waste and missed opportunity if then you think, everything needs to be done by the state, because that's not the way to do it. That doesn't mean that I don't want the state to do things. Of course, there's essential things that it needs to do. But just this kind of Chinese model of needs to be the state leading it all is just not going to happen. But there's a but there, and this is maybe, I'm always relatively optimistic still about the China side here. So, and I can be totally wrong, and again in a couple of years, and in fact even with my former colleagues at the Foreign Office in the UK, I totally disagree. But there is one view which I tend to subscribe to, is that for China, probably two things still are crucially important in coming years. And then there's a third thing that we totally underline. The two things that are really totally important is that, it still needs to grow, keep on growing its economy. And it can't shift its model to totally domestic oriented. It is actually dependent still on forces of globalization and growth in the world. Okay? So it needs to, economic growth and economic cohabitation with the West and so on in the world is still in its interest. It needs to trade. So related to that, it has an interest in trying to be, playing a role in an effective way in being part of the global economy. So, and the related thing comes to that is that, the one thing that China has reasonably been good at is learning from its economic mistakes. And there's definitely one thing going on at the moment, that at the moment it's Belt and Road, there's actually no more new investments. We just continue talking?
Yeah.
When the lights go off? Yeah. So Belt and Road, there's actually no new investment going on. And I'm pretty sure that in Beijing, and I know that this was happening even before COVID, there's the beginning of thinking about it. Is this the best way of engaging with the rest of the world? So that gives me a certain optimism that it's not going to naively push something there. And in fact, anecdotally, we definitely had the experience that in the years we were working with a group very highly connected in the State Council in Beijing, where initially they would simply have this kind of flat-pack version of China, say every country should develop by state-led development, infrastructure, special economic zones, and everywhere it will work. Where we got towards the end of our interactions, maybe 5 years ago, that people start saying, yes, it's probably important for China that they understand the local context, because the state is not necessarily as we understand the state. In our case, there are probably weaknesses in, what they called, there are political risks, which meant basically we invest in some leader, and it has to be a total crook, and so on. They call that political risks that we want to do it. So, they need to learn, because their money is not giving a return. They actually are not really getting a return to their investments either. So that gives me hope. These are the two things. It's a bit like they still have an interest in trying to do it well, and they're beginning to learn from what they've been doing. What makes me very worried is essentially then the geopolitics, where, and then it's, maybe I don't know where the right blame is, but I do worry actually about some of the positions that Western countries have taken by making a narrative that everything China does must be bad, that it is intentionally trying to neo-colonize African countries. Now, I'm not saying it was totally benign. It wanted natural resources and did some very dodgy financing deals of natural resources and infrastructure deals linked to natural resource payments and so on. So these are not benign. But the problem is a little bit that if we, in a context of geopolitical change, if we keep pushing these narratives, we risk making it worse. Because, what is the rational response if you're being pushed politically in a particular corner to actually fight and actually deny it and then actually, and the next time we say, then basically China says, look, if that's a game you're going to play, I'm going to give an extra big loan to the crooks in DRC or something. And then, the West needs to come up, and then you get this kind of strange competition that you actually start encouraging, where I don't think that was what fundamentally they were after, competing with the West in Africa. They were actually just trying to set up their whatever it's called, their initial points of engagement. And yeah, they were playing the game because they have a lot of infrastructure firms that need jobs. they have a lot of capability to sell infrastructure, because that's the thing. So yeah, geopolitics is worrying there, and then we'll have to see where that goes.
We've come to the end of the program. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something from this event. Thank you.